Scrumpy McFearless was a sailor who sailed the world over, up from Portland to Queenstown to Liverpool and round the Horn of Africa to India and China in great long circles while months turned into years. With all this labor, this pulling on bowlines, hoisting masts, and swabbing decks, Scrumpy rarely ever had a shilling or a dime to call his own, for sailors in those days came into port penniless, or nearly so, stayed in sailors' boarding houses that charged high rates, and took most of their advanced wages from the next ship to pay the tab. So they went round the world like woolly lambs who let themselves be sheared in every port they visited. Scrumpy had never intended to be a sailor. In fact, the thought had never ever crossed his mind. He was born the son of a logger and grown up in logging camps in Oregon. When he was 17 years old, he grew a fine beard and took up smoking and called himself a man. All his life he had heard stories about the magnificent times the other loggers had had up in Portland. There the liquor flowed like a fountain, the ladies were all friendly, and a fine time could be had at a small price. There was even an elephant in the city park zoo. Imagine that, an elephant. So Scrumpy set off for Portland with about $4.75 in loose change and a whole lot of foolish notions of what was possible to accomplish in such a venture. The train got into Union Station as night was falling. Scrumpy was, of course, flabbergasted. He had not imagined Portland to be quite so large, but more like a bigger version of Cottage Grove, the nearest village to his logging camp. Having never been in a big city before, he set out walking, looking for the famous watering hole and house of ill fame, Ericson's saloon, that he had heard so much about. He walked up one street and down the other, stopping every now and then to wet his whistle with a beer or two at one of the many saloons. After he had reached a point of pleasant inebriation, he stumbled upon a copper, who instead of directing him to Ericson's, gave him a speech about some fellow named Vagrant, who seemed to spend a lot of time at some resort called Kelly Butte, busting rocks with a hammer. When the copper asked Scrumpy if he'd like to go to Kelly Butte, Scrumpy just said he'd have to see about it. He thanked the copper and walked on. And what do you know? Before long he rounded a corner, and there it was, Ericson's, a more beautiful place he had never seen. He opened the door with great anticipation and stepped in. It was a lively place, a world unto itself, with every sort of pleasure imagined by man ready and on tap. Scrumpy had heard tell that there were 5 bars, one of them the longest in the world, 86 feet or some such thing. Somewhere there was a theater with dancing girls, a famous painting of slave market in Rome, and a 300-pound bouncer named Jumbo Riley, who was a pretty nice fellow as long as you didn't get on his bad side. Scrumpy wandered around and found the theater, but it was empty. The show didn't start until 10 o'clock, and it was now 7:30. He wandered around some more and found the famous Orchestrion, supposedly the largest in the world. But it wasn't making any music, and Scrumpy wasn't about to touch it. So he stood at the bar, too shy to talk to any of the other swells and dandies nearby, and he drank beer after beer until the very last nickel of his $4.75 was gone. Before too long, Mr. August Ericson himself was politely asking him to leave, but to come back when he had a little more money. Scrumpy staggered out into the night, unsure of what to do next. Maybe he'd try that Kelly Heath place the copper had told him about. After nearly being knocked over by a carriage, his luck changed. A man came up to him, introduced himself as John McCarran, and that he owned a boarding house where Scrumpy was welcome to spend the night. As they walked along, McCarran clapped an arm on his shoulder and began talking about a sailor's life. Scrumpy thought that maybe McCarran was a few shingles short of a roof.
And when I hear anybody say now that a sailor has a wife in every port, I just say to myself, well, it's better to have a wife in every port than to have them all running around in the same port. Aye, aye, aye. Oh, but it's a grand life as a sailor. As sailors is a free and open life. There you are. You're away out there on the bounding, rolling seas and ceaseless sea from morning till night. Oh, I tell you, there's nothing like it, nothing like a life on the rolling sea.
So the night came to an end, with Scrumpy falling fully clothed into the straw and on into a dreamless sleep. Earlier that day at Mersey Dock on Front Street, the British bark Blalock had finished taking on a load of wheat and was set to sail with the tide at dawn. When Captain Blackford discovered that he needed one more able seaman to fill out the crew, he headed up through the north end of town to Burnside Street and the offices of J.P. Betts, Portland's shipping master. There he found Betts talking with Larry Sullivan, proprietor of the Sailors' Home. Sullivan assured Captain Blackford that he had just the man for the job. The payment would be $60 advanced wages, $20 in shipping fees, and another $20 for outfitting the sailor with oilskins and boots. These were quite possibly the highest prices anywhere on the globe. While counting out the money to pay Betts, Captain Blackford made it clear that he would accept no inexperienced hobos or farmer boys like on his last visit, to which Sullivan sucked on his cigar and laughed, shaking his head, while Mr. Betts pinned the name John Doe on the shipping roster. On his way back to the ship, Captain Blackford stopped at the British Vice Consul to pay the $5 fee that would be charged for reading ship's articles to the new man. That evening, just before the consul's office closed, Larry Sullivan sent one of his runners up to the office to hear and sign the articles of employment in the name of one John Doe. Scrumpy slept like a log until shortly before dawn. A hack driven by a bald fellow called Harry pulled up at the sailor's boarding house. Harry ran upstairs, woke Scrumpy with an excited, come on, it's time to go." In a daze, Scrumpy was half dragged down the stairs and on into the hack. There was a sad-eyed fellow with a deputy U.S. Marshal badge and a Colt Army pistol in the hack. As they rode along, the deputy kept referring to Scrumpy as Mr. Doe and telling him how some fellow named Betts had said he was a sailor, and that if Betts said you were a sailor, then you were a sailor. You might have thought you were a cowboy, a hobo, a logger, or just a bum. But if Mr. Betts said you were a sailor, then it was off to sea. And he was there himself to make sure that there was no backing out of the deal. Scrumpy was about to carry on a fuss, but then he saw that they were going on board a steam tug, which seemed pretty exciting. And before long, he saw he was going to get a chance to go on board a real sailing ship. Scrumpy figured he'd go along with the deal until they straightened things out. That way he would get to sail on a sailing ship and have some real adventures to tell when he got back to the logging camp. That was some years ago. Since then, Scrumpy's been to England, Germany, France, parts of Africa, India, and China. You see, this is the way shanghaiing worked most of the time. Sure, sometimes boarding house folks got hard up and had to slip somebody a Mickey Finn or crack them on the head with a slugshot. But most of the time, they just put some fellow in a situation they couldn't get out of easily and backed it up with a crooked lawman or a first mate handy with a pistol and a shotgun. And most of the folks just went along with that sort of thing. They called it shipping landlubbers. See, bullying people into doing things is as old as civilization itself. And the other folks, the respectable folks, just think, poor sap, good thing that wasn't me. From the early 1870s on up into World War I, Portland and Astoria had some of the most ruthless and wicked Shanghaiers in the world. You can find out about all these folks and more in my book, The Oregon Shanghaiers. It's the true story, and not the same old made-up bunkum that's been bandied around since the 1930s. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.
Come, dear Jane, now let's get together.
And don't you love that nice summer weather?
So let's go to that beautiful sea.
I'll follow along. It's you for me.
Anything that I would suggest to you.
Yes, dear heart, I think it's the best to do.
So jump in my Ford.
All aboard.
Gee, I want to be
By the sea.
by the sea.
By the beautiful sea.
You and I.
You and I.
Oh, how happy we'll be.
When each wave comes rolling in.
We will duck or swim.
And we'll float and fool around the water.
Over and under.
And then up forever.
R is rich.
And my is rich.
So now what do we care?
I love to be beside your side.
Beside the sea.
Beside the